Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today, I'd like to talk a bit about the power of spirits. I'll be focusing today on how ghosts haunt our universities in particular, but of course, there really are a lot of haunted places, and ghosts really haunt us all. And I like to think there's something in this that we can all, in a way, take home with us. It's a topic that may not seem at first to have much to do with the theme or themes of this series, love and desire, according to Plato and the Platonic tradition, or even of philosophy as a whole. But I actually believe they're all bound up with one another in the most intimate way, and I hope to show that. The topic actually suggested itself to me because of something I've been talking a fair bit about in the last several episodes, and that I'm not quite done with yet. It's this idea of the esoteric Plato and the often bitter controversy that met this theory when it started to be highly elaborated by a group of scholars at Germany's University of Tübingen starting in the late 1950s. You may remember the Tübingen scholars held that Plato's philosophy formed a system, one grounded in a sort of mathematical mysticism that he never wrote about explicitly in his dialogues, but taught in person to his close followers at his school, the academy. These scholars believe the dialogues in many places hint at this teaching, and they also amassed a considerable body of what they said was evidence for these unwritten doctrines of Plato in the writings of Aristotle and many other ancient philosophers. Several episodes ago, I talked about the unusual level of mutual animosity or plain nastiness that this theory led to. An animosity that has even risen or fallen, if you prefer, to the leveling of an accusation of harm, that the theory was doing great harm to Platonic studies, and personal or ad hominem, in other words, attacks, that its detractors were in some way spiritually immature, and so on. Of course, this kind of nastiness isn't entirely foreign to the Academy. Henry Kissinger and many others have famously alluded to the frequent bitterness of academic politics, for example. And academic politics is perhaps not that far removed from academic study. Politics is closely tied to ideology, after all, and ideology is often closely tied to academic study, especially, I think, in the humanities. And academic debates, especially those involving individuals and institutions that value reputation highly, can sometimes have this character of taking no prisoners, something into which intrudes the most intensely competitive spirit. A game, it becomes, except one in which the stakes are high because of all the time, lifetimes actually, that the players have put into it. I think, though, that to many of us watching from the sidelines, there's something both unseemly and kind of ridiculous about nastiness in the academy. It's something lay people kind of like to laugh at. And I think it's ridiculous, I think, because the points that seem to cause such contention often seem trivial to us. In this, we may be wrong. And this, of course, is an important theme of Plato's Republic, that philosophers often seem ridiculous to most people because most people don't understand the significance of the things philosophers wrestle with. But I think we could also be at least partly right if what we are seeing in the academy is a tendency to miss the forest out of an excessive focus on trees, which I think is possible. Anyway, this bitterness can also seem unseemly because it seems to clash with the spirit of scientific objectivity that we expect in the academy, one in which we would expect emotion perhaps to be checked at the door. And I think there's a case it's particularly unseemly for anyone who would look to Socrates with admiration. If you're already familiar with the works of Plato, you'll recognize heatedness in debate as something quite foreignness to the almost ever smiling Socrates. If you're familiar with the Republic, you may recognize here instead something of the spirit of Thrasymachus, whose precious reputation and livelihood are tied up with winning, or seeming to win. Finally, there's one more reason, I think, why this rancor over the Tübingen interpretation could be uncalled for. As we've seen in the last couple of episodes, the question at hand could be largely moot, as there seems to be a growing consensus that the dialogues contain at least something like, or at least the basics of, what the Tübingen scholars said was Plato's esoteric teaching, but implicitly rather than explicitly, that this teaching is hinted at in and can be inferred from them. So you might be thinking that to linger on the nastiness of the Tübingen controversy may seem like a waste of time. But I actually don't think it is, because I think the very heatedness of it says important stuff about our own time, about the life-transforming potential of Plato's teaching on love and desire, and, as I mentioned earlier, about the power that spirits hold over us. And I'd like to talk about that last point now. Of course, I'm hardly the first one to notice and be intrigued by this heatedness. In 2012, for example, a book came out called The Other Plato, the Tübingen interpretation of Plato's inner academic teachings. The book is a compilation of essays by the Tübingen scholars and some of their more recent followers, and it was edited by Dmitry Nikulin, a philosophy professor at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And actually, I'd really recommend it for anyone looking for a single volume overview of the Tübingen interpretation. Anyway, in his introduction, Nikulin alludes to the animosity this difference of opinion seems to have stirred up, and he seems to suggest he suggests it's because of the elusiveness of Plato, and this in turn largely because what we have from Plato are not treatises but dialogues, which are at once philosophical and literary works. And it's the nature of literature and art in general, of course, to be kind of elusive and mysterious. The Symposium, for example, is first of all story, the story of a party, and we're free to draw from this story whatever moral we want to. And there are characters in it like Socrates and Diotima whose opinions we can infer to be Plato's, but not with certainty, and perhaps not wholly. As Nikulin puts it, Plato is a unique character among the dramatis personae in the history of philosophy. No other thinker arouses so much emotion and dissent among readers and interpreters. Passions are inevitably stirred when one tries to answer a simple question. What does Plato want to say, and what does he actually say? Plato wrote dialogues which are fine pieces of literature and reasoning, but which may always be read and interpreted differently, especially since the speakers often do not commit themselves to any particular philosophical position, and the question discussed frequently remains unanswered and sometimes not even explicitly asked. Moreover, it is neither easy to discern Plato's own position at any given moment in the discussion, nor who is speaking behind his characters. I mean, is that Plato speaking behind Diotima? It's hard. We can't really know with 100% certainty. And a little later, Nikulin writes, because of the seeming uncertainty of what has actually been said, reading Plato is a fascinating yet risky enterprise, for we might need to reconsider not only our understanding of a text, but also the very principles of philosophical reading and interpretation. I think all of this is true and helpful to ponder by anyone who reads Plato. I also think, though, that there's a reason beyond the legendary elusiveness of Plato for the animosity that surrounded the debate over the Tübingen interpretation. I think it stirred up some ghosts. And ghosts, of course, seem to be, well, they are at their angriest when people are most indifferent to their grievances, aren't they? So I think it might be worthwhile to listen to try to recognize these existence of these spirits, and then also to listen to what they're telling us. A decade before Nikulin's book came out, Ian Mueller, a professor at the University of Chicago, addressed in a paper the disagreement around the Tübingen position, citing what he called a number of, quote, non-intellectual factors, unquote, at work. He opens his paper with some examples, some of which I mentioned a few episodes ago, of the salvos the two sides have laid down against each other, and he comments, I suspect that this circle of accusations could be continued indefinitely, and he adds, it would be rash to suggest that there might be a full resolution of this impasse. The problems here are not simply intellectual or scientific. Enormous personal commitments are involved, commitments which are reinforced by institutions of historical scholarship based on distinct schools of interpretation, each of which pushes its line as far as it can be pushed. And then he says a bit later, I am not inclined to think that disagreements of this kind will be resolved, at least not by any process I would call rational. Mueller doesn't go into detail about the non-intellectual factors he has in mind here, but I think it can be inferred that he was talking about deep-set loyalties held by scholars on both sides. Loyalties, I think, both to people and ideas, and non-intellectual, I think, in the sense that the scholars with these loyalties are perhaps not aware or entirely aware of how they influence their thinking. And so these loyalties, like angry spirits, end up manifesting themselves in these irrational ways. And indeed, what we're talking about here, I think, is the essence of what it is to be haunted. It seems to me, anyway, impossible to avoid the conclusion that the idea that humanity through its history has been trying to express with the idea of ghosts is of the psyche being disturbed by powerful forces of which it isn't consciously aware. This is one reason, I think, why we find the image of the haunted house so compelling. Isn't the house with its many rooms such an apt metaphor for the psyche? And aren't ghosts just particularly fond of those rooms like attics, these out-of-the-way receptacles of the past that we don't actually step into very much, that might contain things that are precious and interesting, but we don't feel like getting to them because we might be deterred by the cobwebs or the other nastinesses that might await us up there. There's another way that the spirits of the dead are involved in the passion this debate stirred up, I think, and that has to do with another largely unconscious tendency, our tendency toward heroicization. I think we're rather unconscious in general of the way our heroes influence us, to the point where we might not even be aware that we have heroes at all. I do think, however, that the age of myth and heroes never left us. It would be quite naive, I think, to think that. Because these things are universal to human life, I think they're really just kind of how we operate. And I can't help but be reminded now of that very powerful moment near the beginning of Dante's Inferno. I don't know if you know it, but he meets the ancient Roman poet Virgil, who will end up saving the protagonist, also called Dante. Among one of the many things that the Divine Comedy has in common with Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time is that the protagonist is from a first-person perspective, and the protagonist is also has the same name as the author. There are so many other things too. I mean, Proust's work also, the character starts in a dark wood of sorts, and he sees both kind of infernos and paradises throughout that work. But anyway, so like the Proust's work, the Divine Comedy, Dante's work, purports to be autobiographical. Anyway, it'll be Virgil who rescues Dante from the dark forest that he's found himself in by serving as his guide through hell and purgatory. When Dante in this first canto sees and recognizes Virgil, he says to him, "O light and honor of all other poets, may my long study and the intense love that made me search your volume serve me now. You are my master and my author. You, the only one from whom my writing drew the noble style for which I've been honored." Long study and intense love. You are my master and my author. It seems clear to me that for Dante, Virgil was more than just a writer whose work he found interesting. He became so present to Dante, it doesn't matter that he'd been long dead. It felt, I think, to Dante as though he loved Virgil and Virgil loved him. As Dante lived his life, Virgil became a kind of interpreter of the world for him, and through that, a shaper of his identity. The hero comes to be a certain embodiment, or perhaps better, a locus of deep hope for people. And I think when this happens, they also project onto that hero the traits they most admire, the ideas that give them the most hope. In this sense, the spirits of the heroic dead live on as these extremely powerful vehicles or receptacles of our hope. It seems kind of unlikely to me that someone who spends a pretty big chunk of their life studying someone hasn't likewise, on some level, heroicized that person, quite possibly without being aware of it, or at least aware of all the hope they've placed on this person. The Tübingen scholar Hans-Joachim Kramer actually insisted he wasn't a Platonist himself, and he probably wasn't atypical in this for someone in the academy. But I can't help but think there must be somehow more to the story than comes across in that bare denial. Of course, this needn't always involve the kind of deep love Dante felt for the Virgil of his imagining, and also the aforementioned need for scientific objectivity to avoid publicly expressing their loyalties in this way. But it's hard not to think they must place some kind of deep hope in the thinkers they study. Otherwise, it seems a bit like being married to someone you don't even like. I mean, it's a lot of time to spend with somebody. So to try to sum up what I've been saying here, I think the nastiness that the Tübingen interpretation of Plato gave rise to is due to a tendency to see Plato as a philosophical hero, to basically be the embodiment of philosophical virtue, of the gift of philosophy, or rather the embodiment of one's assumptions of what philosophical virtue is, or the gift of philosophy is. And of course, not everyone shares the same assumptions about that. And crucially, this channeling of hope into Plato is, I suspect, not entirely recognized by the great minds in which it sometimes happens. And so we see the power of spirits here, the power, in other words, of that which exists in the unconscious, in the attics of our minds, but is unrecognized by us. And in the classical world, I use this metaphor of the attic, but in the classical world, of course, the hero descends to the underworld and sometimes talks to these heroes. And the underworld is also just a kind of wonderful image for the unconscious. Anyway, if it's true that this haunting is the reason for the nastiness we've seen in the battle for the soul of Plato, then it surely must be that a resolution of the dispute, the non-rational process that Ian Miller implied might resolve it in some way must lie in a kind of exorcism. And it seems to me that the best way to exorcise a ghost is to listen to it. Don't you find it a striking pattern in movies about hauntings that the haunting ends when humans, after a terrifying ordeal, finally come to understand the ghost's grievance? And so if we want to defuse the tension in our academic and our ideological and hence even political debates, actually inside but also outside the academy, we need, I think, to understand the unconscious elements that feed the hostility in them. In the case of the controversy created by the Tübingen professors, what I've called the battle for the soul of Plato, these motivations, I think, came from deeply held differences about the purpose of philosophy itself. Differences that manifested themselves in this division that Western philosophy found itself in the 20th century. And that's what I'll be talking about next episode. Hope to see you then, and once again, thanks for watching.